My wife wanted an open marriage. She was when she saw a video of me having with another woman, but it was too late. It started like any other evening. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels, and Emma was upstairs. We'd been married for 6 years, and while I'd never thought we had a perfect relationship, I never questioned our loyalty to each other. We had our routines, our quirks, and our arguments, but I always believed we were solid. I never thought there would be anything that could shake my trust in her. Until that night, Emma had left her phone on the kitchen counter, charging. Usually, I wouldn't think twice about it. We both respected each other's privacy. But this time, a message notification flashed on the screen, and before I knew it, I found myself glancing over. What I saw made my stomach drop. It was a series of search results that immediately caught my attention. The first line read, "Legal ways to have an affair without getting caught." I blinked, hoping I'd read it wrong. I picked up her phone and scrolled through the open tabs, my heart pounding faster with each passing second. The searches were all variations on the same theme. How to hide an affair, what rights does a cheating spouse have, how to avoid getting caught. There were even questions about prenups and alimony, all time-stamped within the last few days. It felt like the floor had opened up beneath me. I knew I shouldn't have looked further, but I couldn't stop myself. I wanted to believe that this was some kind of mistake, that there was an explanation that didn't involve betrayal. But the deeper I dug, the more impossible it became to deny what I was seeing. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. We'd been together for so long. How could she even consider doing this? I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that the woman I loved, the woman I'd shared my life with, could be plotting something so cold and calculated behind my back. For a while, I just stood there in the kitchen, staring at the phone in my hand, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. I knew I had to confront her, to demand answers, but I couldn't bring myself to do it yet. If she was willing to plan an affair, what else could she be hiding from me? I needed to know the extent of it before I faced her. I needed proof, evidence that would tell me how far she was planning to go. The first person I thought of was Alex, my best friend since college. He was the only one I could trust with something like this, the only person who could help me think it through. I called him that night, and he came over right away, finding me pacing in the living room, still in shock. "James, what's going on?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. He'd never seen me like this, and I could tell he knew something was seriously wrong. I explained everything, showing him the searches, walking him through my discovery. He listened in stunned silence, his expression shifting from confusion to anger as I spoke. When I finished, he let out a low whistle, running a hand through his hair. "Man, that's rough," he said finally. "I can't believe she'd do something like this. I mean, are you sure it's not just, I don't know, research for something else?" I shook my head. "There's no other explanation, Alex. I mean, look at the searches. They're all about affairs, prenups, divorce. She's clearly thinking about it, if she hasn't already started." Alex nodded slowly, his face grim. "So, what do you want to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? I hadn't figured it out yet. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand answers and let the chips fall where they may. But another part of me, the part that needed to understand why, wanted to know more. I needed to see the whole picture before I acted. "I need to know if she's actually doing it," I said, the words heavy in my mouth. "I need to know how far she's willing to go." Alex studied me for a moment before nodding. "Then you need evidence. Something that will confirm whether or not she's already crossed the line." It was exactly what I was thinking. I had to get proof, something concrete that would either confirm my worst fears or, by some miracle, prove me wrong. I didn't want to believe it was true, but I couldn't ignore the signs either. I had to be sure. We spent the next few hours setting up hidden cameras around the house. It felt surreal, like something out of a spy movie. I never thought I'd be the kind of guy who would monitor his wife, who would question her loyalty. But I couldn't afford to let this go. I had to know the truth. I placed one camera in the living room, another in the kitchen, and one more in the bedroom. I wanted to cover as much ground as possible, to catch any conversations, any phone calls, any signs that she was meeting someone else. Every move felt like a betrayal of the trust one had once had in her, but I couldn't let that stop me. I needed answers, even if they destroyed me. Once everything was set up, I spent the next few days living in a haze of suspicion and anxiety. Every time Emma left the house, I found myself wondering where she was going, who she was meeting. I started to notice little things I'd never paid attention to before. The way she would glance at her phone with a slight smile, the way she seemed to be preoccupied, lost in thought. Were these the signs I had missed all along? Or was I just seeing what I expected to see, now that the doubt had taken root in my mind? The tension between us was thick, though she didn't seem to notice. I would catch her looking at me with a puzzled expression, as if she could sense that something was off, but she never said anything. If she suspected that I knew, she didn't let on. It was like we were both playing roles, each of us pretending not to see the growing chasm between us. Then, one afternoon, I came across the first piece of real evidence. I was reviewing the footage from the hidden cameras when I saw Emma sitting in the living room, talking on her phone. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper, but I could hear enough to piece together what was happening. She was speaking to someone, a man, about meeting up, about keeping things discreet. The conversation was brief, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. She was cheating. The reality of it hit me like a tidal wave, a flood of emotions that left me breathless. I felt betrayed, humiliated, furious. I wanted to confront her, to yell, to demand answers, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed more evidence, something undeniable that I could confront her with, something that would force her to admit what she'd done. I kept watching the footage, my anger building with each passing day. I saw her make plans, lie about her whereabouts, even go so far as to meet up with him when she said she was going to see a friend. Each lie was like a dagger to the heart, and I could feel my trust in her eroding with every new revelation. Through it all, Alex remained by my side, offering support, helping me plan my next steps. He was as shocked as I was, unable to believe that the woman we both knew could be capable of such deceit. He reminded me to stay focused, to gather as much evidence as possible before making any moves. As the days wore on, I found myself growing numb to the hurt, to the anger. I became a silent observer, watching from the shadows as my marriage fell apart, piece by piece. I had gone from being a husband to a detective, from a partner to an adversary. And yet, through it all, I knew there was no going back. I had crossed a line, and there was no erasing what I had seen, what I had learned. The time was coming to confront Emma, to lay out the evidence and demand answers. But first, I needed to be absolutely sure. I needed to gather every piece of the puzzle, to arm myself with the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Only then would I be ready to face her, to demand the truth, and to decide what came next. For now, all I could do was wait, watch, and prepare for the inevitable showdown that lay ahead. The days that followed my initial discovery were a whirlwind of suspicion, resentment, and an ever-growing sense of distance between Emma and me. With each piece of evidence I collected, my anger simmered, but I managed to keep it beneath the surface. I'd see her at breakfast, sipping coffee as if nothing were wrong, and I had to remind myself to play my part, to pretend that I knew nothing. It was exhausting, this double life I was now forced to live, but I had made a decision. If she was going to betray me, I was going to let her fall into her own trap. Watching Emma became my daily ritual, the hidden cameras my constant companions. I'd see her texting someone with a little smirk on her face, or notice her taking phone calls in hushed tones when she thought I was out of earshot. She'd leave for work, dinners, or social gatherings that she had never attended before, her excuses transparent and weak. And yet, I said nothing. I let her think she was in control, that her lies were still intact. But my silence didn't mean acceptance. As I gathered evidence of her betrayal, a dark idea began to take shape in my mind. Why should I sit here and be the victim? If she was prepared to have an affair, to hurt me so deeply, then maybe it was time I turned the tables. If she wanted to play games, I could play too. That's when I thought of Sophie. Sophie and I had been close once, years before I met Emma. We had dated briefly, but it hadn't worked out, too much passion, not enough stability. Still, we'd always remained friends, keeping in touch now and then over social media or the occasional message. I knew she was single, and I wondered if she'd be willing to meet up, to help me with my own plan of retaliation. At first, the idea felt wrong, a betrayal of my own values. But the more I thought about it, the more justified it seemed. If Emma was willing to throw our marriage away, to deceive me so coldly, why should I stand by and suffer in silence? Why should I be the one left feeling hurt, humiliated, powerless? If she could do this to me, then maybe I had the right to return the favor. I reached out to Sophie under the pretense of catching up, but it didn't take long for her to realize that this wasn't just a casual meeting. We met at a bar across town, far from prying eyes, and as we talked, I could feel the old spark between us reigniting. I told her about Emma, about everything I had discovered, about my need for revenge. Sophie listened quietly, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and something else, something that told me she understood exactly what I was going through. "So, what are you planning to do?" she asked, a slight smile playing on her lips. She was enjoying this, I could tell. Sophie had always had a bit of a wild streak, a love for drama and intrigue that had been one of the reasons we hadn't worked out in the past. "I don't know," I replied, swirling my drink. "I just know I need to level the playing field. I want her to know that I'm not some naive fool who'll just take it. If she can do this to me, I can do it to her." Sophie leaned forward, her hand resting on mine. "If you're serious, James, I'm here to help. Whatever you need." Her touch sent a jolt through me, a reminder of what it felt like to be wanted, to feel a connection that wasn't tainted by lies and deceit. I nodded, grateful for her support, but also aware of the fine line I was walking. This wasn't just about getting back at Emma. This was about reclaiming my dignity, about showing her that I was no one's fool. Over the next few days, I began my own secret dance of deception. I kept up the facade at home, pretending to be the unsuspecting husband while I plotted my own moves in the shadows. Emma seemed oblivious, her own guilt perhaps blinding her to the changes in my behavior. I was careful, making sure to cover my tracks, to erase any trace of my meetings with Sophie, of the messages we exchanged. And all the while, I kept recording, kept observing Emma as she continued her secret affair. It was painful to watch, to see the way she would smile at her phone, the way she would lie to me with such ease. But the pain was numbed by my own plans, by the knowledge that I was no longer helpless, no longer merely a pawn in her game. I had taken control, and it felt intoxicating. Yet, beneath the thrill of revenge, a part of me still struggled with guilt. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, questioning my motives, my choices. Was I really any better than she was? Was this what our marriage had come to? Two people wrapped in lies, each betraying the other? There were moments when I almost backed out, when I considered confronting her, ending the charade, and walking away with whatever dignity I had left. But those moments were fleeting. The hurt, the betrayal, it was too deep, too raw. I wasn't ready to let her off the hook that easily. I needed her to feel the pain I was feeling, to understand that her actions had consequences, that she couldn't just walk all over me and expect me to take it lying down. And so, I pressed on, arranging another meeting with Sophie, letting the excitement of our encounters distract me from the storm brewing at home. We'd meet in secluded places, hidden away from the world, where I could let go of my anger, my frustration, and just be someone else for a while. With Sophie, I could escape the reality of my crumbling marriage, if only for a few hours. It was a temporary reprieve, a taste of freedom that felt both liberating and dangerous. As I spent more time with Sophie, I found myself questioning what I really wanted. Was this just about revenge, or was it something more? Could I see myself with her, building a new life, leaving the mess of my marriage behind? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, a tantalizing glimpse of a future that seemed just out of reach. But no matter how much I tried to escape, the reality of Emma's betrayal was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I couldn't forget the way she had deceived me, the way she had planned her affair so carefully, so methodically. I couldn't let go of the anger that simmered beneath the surface, driving me forward, fueling my need for retribution. And so, I continued my surveillance, gathering evidence, documenting her every move. Each recording, each message, was another piece of the puzzle, another step toward the inevitable confrontation. I knew it was only a matter of time before I'd have to face her, to lay everything out, to watch as her carefully constructed web of lies unraveled. As the days wore on, I felt the tension building, a palpable sense of anticipation that grew with each passing hour. I was walking a tightrope, balancing my need for revenge against the remnants of the love I had once felt for Emma. But with every step, I knew that I was inching closer to the edge, to the moment when everything would come crashing down. The trap was set, and all that was left was to spring it, to watch as Emma fell into the same abyss of betrayal that she had dragged me into. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I was no longer the man she had once known. I was no longer willing to be her victim. The game was about to change, and I was ready to play my part. The decision to meet Sophie hadn't been easy, but once I made it, there was no turning back. I told myself it was just a casual reunion, two old friends catching up. But as I drove to the cafe where we'd agreed to meet, I knew that was a lie. There was nothing innocent about this encounter. This was about revenge, about reclaiming control, about letting Emma feel the sting of betrayal I had been nursing for weeks. Sophie was waiting for me at a corner table, a faint smile on her lips as she saw me walk in. She looked as beautiful as ever, and for a moment, I was hit with a wave of nostalgia, memories of our brief, intense relationship flooding back. She stood up to hug me, and I felt the warmth of her embrace, the familiar scent of her perfume, and it was like stepping back in time. We sat down and ordered drinks, slipping easily into the rhythm of conversation. We talked about the usual things: work, life, the years that had passed since we last saw each other. But there was an underlying tension, a charged energy between us that we both felt but didn't acknowledge. I knew why we were here, and so did she. We didn't need to say it out loud. After a while, I suggested we go somewhere more private, and Sophie didn't hesitate. We ended up at her apartment, and as soon as we walked through the door, the pretense fell away. There were no more excuses, no more pretending. We knew what we were doing, and there was no stopping it. I kissed her, and it was like igniting a spark that had been waiting to catch fire. All the anger, the betrayal, the hurt that had been building up inside me spilled over into that moment. It wasn't just about Sophie. It was about taking back some semblance of power, about proving to myself that I wasn't just a victim. Our encounter was intense, fueled by a mix of passion and defiance. Each kiss, each touch carrying a weight of unspoken emotion. We spent the night together, and for those few hours, I allowed myself to forget about Emma, about the mess my life had become. But as the morning light filtered through the window, reality came crashing back. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I lay beside Sophie, watching her sleep, and felt a wave of guilt wash over me. What was I doing? Had I really become the kind of person who would sink to this level, who would betray the vows I had once taken so seriously? But then I thought of Emma, of the plans she was making, the lies she had told, the deceit she was weaving around me. And just like that, the guilt was replaced by a grim satisfaction. She had made her choice, and now I had made mine. If she thought she could cheat on me without consequence, she was about to learn how wrong she was. I glanced at my phone, where the recording of our night together was saved. I hadn't planned to record it at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the perfect weapon. Emma had no idea what was coming, no idea that I had already turned the tables on her. I wasn't sure when I would show her, but I knew the time would come. She needed to see, to understand the depth of the betrayal she had set in motion. Later that day, after saying goodbye to Sophie, I returned home and resumed my surveillance of Emma. Watching her now felt different, knowing that I was no longer on the receiving end of her deception. I was no longer the passive observer, but an active participant in this twisted game we were both playing. Emma was oblivious, her betrayal unfolding with the same calculated precision I had come to expect. She spent hours on her phone, texting, making plans, arranging meetings with men whose names I didn't know and didn't care to learn. She seemed almost giddy, a spark in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. It was as if she were living a double life, one in which I didn't exist, one where her happiness wasn't tethered to the life we had built together. I watched her, feeling a mixture of anger and contempt, but also a strange sense of detachment. She was no longer the woman I had married, no longer the person I had once loved with all my heart. She had become a stranger, someone I barely recognized, and I wondered if I had ever truly known her at all. In the days that followed, I continued to monitor her, biding my time, waiting for the right moment to confront her. She was careful, meticulous in her deceit, but I could see the cracks beginning to show. I could see the strain in her eyes, the way she would glance over her shoulder, as if sensing that something was off. But she never suspected that I was watching, that I was one step ahead, that I had already set my own trap. My encounters with Sophie became a regular escape, a way to distance myself from the mess of my marriage, to remind myself that there was life beyond Emma's betrayal. Sophie didn't ask questions, didn't press for details. She understood what I needed, and she was willing to give it without judgment, without expectation. In some ways, it felt like the only honest connection I had left. But even as I found solace in Sophie's arms, the guilt continued to gnaw at me. I told myself that I was justified, that Emma had brought this on herself, but a part of me still felt the weight of my own actions. I was no longer innocent, no longer the man I had once been, and I wasn't sure if I could ever go back. As I watched Emma prepare for yet another work trip, I felt the tension building, the anticipation of the confrontation that was now inevitable. I had all the evidence I needed, both of her betrayal and my own. The time was coming to lay everything out, to bring this charade to an end, to force her to face the reality of what she had done. I wondered how she would react, if she would feel the same sting of betrayal that I had felt, if she would understand the pain of being lied to, deceived by someone she had trusted, or would she simply brush it off, justify her actions, continue on as if nothing had changed? I didn't have the answers, but I knew that I couldn't keep living in this web of lies. I couldn't keep playing this game, pretending that everything was fine when it was anything but. The time had come to confront the truth, to face the consequences of our choices, and to decide once and for all what kind of life I wanted to live. The seduction was over, and the trap was set. All that was left was to spring it, to watch as Emma fell, to see if there was anything left to salvage in the wreckage of our lives. The day I decided to send the video felt like the culmination of all the hurt, anger, and betrayal that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. I sat alone in my home office, the video of me and Sophie queued up on my phone, my finger hovering over the send button. It felt surreal, like I was watching myself from the outside, a man transformed by the need for revenge, willing to destroy what little remained of my marriage just to prove a point. I took a deep breath, my mind racing with doubts. I had all the evidence I needed, both of Emma's deception and my own retaliation. But as I stared at the screen, I found myself hesitating. Was this really worth it? Was this single act of retribution worth the inevitable fallout that would follow? Once I sent the video, there would be no going back. Our marriage would be well and truly over, with nothing left to salvage. Memories flooded back. The day we first met, our wedding, the years we had spent building a life together. Despite everything, I remembered the good times, the moments when I had truly believed we could be happy. I wondered if there was anything left of that love, or if it had all been buried beneath the lies and betrayal. Part of me wanted to confront her face to face, to demand answers, to hear her side of the story. But another part of me, the part that had been broken by her actions, wanted her to feel the same shock, the same betrayal that I had felt. In the end, the anger won. With a final exhale, I pressed send and watched as the video disappeared into cyberspace, its destination Emma's phone. There was a strange sense of relief, a feeling that I had taken back some control. I waited, my heart pounding, knowing that any moment now, she would see it, that the confrontation I had been anticipating was finally about to happen. The silence was broken by the sound of Emma's footsteps, hurried and heavy, as she stormed into the room. Her face was a mask of shock and anger, her eyes blazing as she held up her phone, the video still playing on the screen. "What the hell is this, James?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "How could you do this to me?" I met her gaze, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. "I think the real question is, how could you do this to me?" Emma's eyes narrowed, confusion flickering across her face. You're the one who cheated, James. I just watched you with another woman. How could you betray me like this?" I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Don't act so innocent, Emma. I know what you've been up to. I know about your plans, the lies, the secret meetings. You're not the victim here." Her face paled, and for a moment, I saw a flash of fear in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. She thought she held all the cards, that she was the one in control. But now, she was realizing that I knew more than she had anticipated. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, but her voice wavered, betraying her. "Don't lie to me," I snapped, my anger bubbling to the surface. "I've seen the messages, the searches, the calls. I know you've been planning an affair, researching how to cheat without getting caught. You thought you were so clever, didn't you? But I've been watching you, Emma. I've seen everything." She took a step back, her hands shaking, her expression one of pure shock. You've been spying on me?" I shrugged, feeling a twisted sense of vindication. "I did what I had to do. You didn't give me a choice. You were ready to betray me, and you thought I wouldn't find out. Well, surprise. I did." The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said, of all the lies and secrets that had poisoned our marriage. Emma opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if searching for words that could somehow undo the damage. "James," she finally said, her voice softening. I never actually went through with it. I thought about it, yes, but I didn't do it. I was just curious. Curious." I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You expect me to believe that? You were researching every possible way to cheat without consequences, planning secret meetings. And now you're saying it was just curiosity? I'm not that stupid, Emma." She looked away, tears brimming in her eyes, and for a moment, I almost felt a pang of sympathy. Almost. But then I remembered the nights I had spent watching her, the lies she had told, the betrayal that had cut me to the core. There was no room for sympathy here. Emma wiped her eyes, straightening her shoulders as she looked back at me. "And what about you? You actually did it. You went and slept with someone else, just to get back at me. You're no better than I am, James. You're just as guilty." Her words stung, but I held my ground. "Maybe I am, but at least I didn't lie about it. I didn't go behind your back, pretending everything was fine. I gave you a taste of your own medicine. Maybe now you'll understand what it feels like to be betrayed by someone you trusted." The room fell into silence, the weight of our words hanging heavy between us. For the first time, I felt the full impact of what we had done to each other, the destruction we had wrought on the life we had built together. I had wanted revenge, but now, standing there in the wreckage of our marriage, I wondered if it had been worth it. Emma's face softened, her anger fading as she looked at me with a mixture of sadness and regret. "What happened to us, James? How did we get here?" I shook my head, feeling a lump form in my throat. "I don't know. Somewhere along the way, we lost each other. We let the lies, the doubts, the resentment take over. And now there's nothing left." We stood there, staring at each other, two strangers in a house that had once been a home. For a moment, I thought about reaching out to her, about trying to salvage what little remained. But then I remembered the lies, the betrayal, the hurt that had driven us to this point. There was no going back. "So what now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, feeling the finality of the moment settle over me. "I think it's time we face the truth. We're both guilty, both responsible for what's happened. Maybe it's time we go our separate ways." Emma nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she looked away. "Maybe you're right. We both knew that this was the end, that there was no saving what was already broken. The evidence had been laid bare, the truth exposed, and there was no hiding from it anymore. We had both betrayed each other, both crossed lines that could never be uncrossed." As I watched her walk away, I felt a strange sense of relief, mingled with sadness. I had wanted revenge, but now that I had it, the victory felt hollow. There was no satisfaction in winning a battle that had left us both wounded, no triumph in a game where we had both lost. The evidence had been revealed, the confrontation had come and gone, and all that was left was the quiet aftermath, the silence of a life that had been shattered beyond repair. I knew that I would carry the scars of this betrayal for a long time, that I would never forget the lies, the deception, the pain. But I also knew that I had taken back control, that I had faced the truth, no matter how ugly it had been. And in the end, that was all I could ask for. As I walked out of the room, leaving the wreckage of my marriage behind, I felt a strange sense of peace. The truth had been painful, but it had also been freeing. I was no longer bound by the lies, no longer trapped in a web of secrets. I had faced the evidence, and I had survived. And now, it was time to move on, to rebuild, to find a new path forward, free from the shadows of the past. After the explosive confrontation, the house was silent, filled with an unspoken tension that pressed down on both of us like a weight we couldn't lift. I knew that I had broken through Emma's defenses, that I had finally forced her to face the truth. But even with the satisfaction of seeing her caught off guard, I could feel the hollowness in the victory. We sat in the living room, a chasm of resentment and betrayal between us. For a while, we didn't speak. Emma's face was set in a hard line, her arms crossed as she avoided my gaze. I knew she was waiting for me to say something, to break the silence, but I had already said everything that mattered. Now, it was her turn. She let out a long sigh, her shoulders sagging. "Fine. You're right," she said, her voice flat. "I was planning to have an affair. I'd been thinking about it for a long time, actually." I didn't respond right away, letting her words hang in the air. I wanted her to feel the weight of her own confession, to know that there was no escaping the truth now. "But do you even realize why?" she continued, her tone shifting to one of accusation. "Do you even understand what drove me to that point?" I felt a spark of anger flare up, but I kept my voice steady. "Why don't you enlighten me, Emma? I'd love to hear your reasons for planning to cheat on me." She glared at me, her eyes flashing. "Don't act like you're innocent in all of this, James. You've been distant for months. No, years. You barely look at me anymore, barely talk to me. It's like you've been checked out of this marriage for a long time." I scoffed, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You think that justifies cheating? That because I've been busy or preoccupied, that gives you the right to go behind my back and plan an affair?" She crossed her arms tighter, her jaw set. "It wasn't just that. It was everything. The lack of affection, the way you just stopped caring. You stopped putting in any effort, James. I felt like I was invisible to you, like you didn't even see me anymore. What was I supposed to do?" A bitter laugh escaped me, and I shook my head. "So, instead of talking to me, instead of telling me how you felt, you decided to go online and research ways to cheat. That's how you thought we'd fix things? By lying? By sneaking around?" Emma's face softened, a flicker of regret crossing her features. "I know it was wrong. I know that. But I was desperate. I was looking for something, anything, that would make me feel alive again. I thought maybe it would fill the emptiness." "You didn't even give me a chance to fix things," I said, the hurt in my voice barely concealed. "You just went ahead and made up your mind that cheating was the answer. You threw everything we had away for what? A quick thrill? A temporary escape?" She looked away, silent for a moment. "It wasn't just about that. It was about feeling wanted again, feeling like I mattered. And yes, I know that's my own issue, but you can't pretend like you didn't play a part in it." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "You think you're the only one who felt neglected? Do you even realize how hard I've been working, how much I've been trying to keep everything together? I may have been distant, but it wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I thought you understood what we were building, that you were in it with me." She looked back at me, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I was in it, James. But somewhere along the way, we lost each other. We stopped being a team. And when that happened, I started looking for something else. I know it was wrong, but it was the only way I knew how to cope." I could feel the anger ebbing, replaced by a wave of sadness. I knew there was truth in her words, that I had indeed let my focus shift away from her, from us. But I couldn't let that justify what she had done. She had chosen betrayal over communication, and that was a line I couldn't overlook. "Well, congratulations, Emma," I said, my voice heavy. "You found what you were looking for. And now we're both standing here in the ruins of what we used to have, because we were both too blind to see it slipping away." She wiped her eyes, her expression hardening. And what about you, James? Don't act like you're blameless here. You didn't just find out about my plans and confront me. You went and slept with someone else, first chance you got. What does that say about you? I met her gaze, unflinching. It says that I wasn't going to sit here and let you play me for a fool. You broke the trust first, Emma. You gave up on us, and I did what I had to do to protect myself. Maybe it was wrong, maybe it wasn't, but you don't get to sit there and act like you're the only one who's been hurt. The silence that followed was thick with tension, each of us grappling with the weight of our own actions, our own justifications. For the first time, I saw Emma not as the woman I had loved, but as someone broken, someone who had made choices I couldn't understand or forgive. And as I looked at her, I realized that the same could probably be said of me. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. So, what now? Where do we go from here? I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the exhaustion settle over me. Maybe it's time we stop pretending that we can fix this. Maybe it's time to be honest with ourselves about what's left between us. Emma nodded, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Are you saying you want a divorce? The word hung in the air, stark and final. I had thought about it, of course, over the past few weeks as everything had unraveled. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real, made it something I couldn't ignore. I don't see another way forward, Emma. Not after everything we've done to each other. We've both betrayed each other, both crossed lines we can't come back from. Maybe it's better if we just let go. Her face crumpled, and I could see the pain in her eyes, the realization that this was the end. For a moment, I thought she might argue, might try to convince me to give it one more shot. But then she nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. Maybe you're right, she said quietly. Maybe it's better to end things now, before we hurt each other even more. We sat in silence, two people who had once shared everything, now reduced to strangers contemplating the end of a life they had built together. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a sense of loss that I couldn't shake, but I knew that this was the right decision. There was no coming back from what we had done, no way to rebuild the trust we had shattered. As we stood up, preparing to walk away from each other, I felt a strange sense of peace. The anger, the resentment, the need for revenge. It had all faded, leaving only the quiet acceptance that this was where our story ended. Goodbye, James, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Goodbye, Emma. And with that, we went our separate ways, each of us carrying the scars of a love that had turned to ashes, knowing that we could never go back, but perhaps finally free to move forward. The decision had been made, but the reality of separation was more painful than I had anticipated. Once the initial shock wore off, there was the cold, practical side of dismantling a life built together over 6 years. Every day seemed to bring another argument, another accusation, as Emma and I tried to navigate the minefield of separating our lives. The first fight was over the house. Neither of us wanted to stay, but neither of us wanted the other to have it, either. The memories that clung to every corner, every room, made the thought of living there unbearable, yet it felt like a defeat to let it go. Then there were the accounts, the belongings, the furniture. Pieces of a shared life that now had to be divided like spoils of war. Our friends and family quickly became entangled in the fallout, taking sides, offering their unsolicited advice. Some of them wanted to stay neutral, but that rarely worked. They'd try to offer platitudes about moving on and learning from this, but those words felt hollow. They hadn't been there, hadn't seen the depths of betrayal or the heights of rage that had filled our home. In the end, almost everyone took a side. My sister, Claire, immediately called Emma a conniving snake and insisted I was better off without her. She had never liked Emma, never missed an opportunity to remind me that she'd never been good enough for me. Her support, while appreciated, only added to the noise, the anger. It made the situation feel more like a spectacle, a family drama unfolding for everyone to watch. Emma's best friend, Lisa, on the other hand, was quick to defend her, claiming that I had pushed her away, that I had driven her to the point of considering an affair. The accusations cut deep, even though I knew they were just echoes of what Emma must have been saying. It felt as if everyone had an opinion, everyone had a judgment, and in the process, our private pain became a public spectacle. As the weeks passed, I started to question my decisions. Revenge had felt right at the time. It had given me a sense of control, a way to reclaim my dignity. But now, as I sat alone in the nearly empty house, surrounded by boxes of things that no longer felt like mine, I wondered if it had been worth it. The satisfaction of catching Emma off guard, of exposing her betrayal, had faded, leaving only a gnawing emptiness in its place. I replayed our arguments in my mind, trying to pinpoint where things had gone wrong. I had thought revenge would bring me closure, but all it had done was deepen the wound, make it impossible to heal. Instead of finding peace, I had found remorse, a quiet voice whispering that perhaps I had been just as guilty as Emma, that maybe my actions had only added fuel to the fire. Yet, despite the loneliness, the regret, I couldn't bring myself to reach out to her. The divide between us felt insurmountable, a chasm filled with accusations and bitterness. I told myself I was better off, that I was finally free, but in the quiet moments, I wondered if freedom was just another word for isolation. Emma, meanwhile, seemed to thrive on her own brand of defiance. I would hear through mutual friends that she was going out, putting on a brave face, acting as though the breakup hadn't fazed her. It was almost as if she was determined to prove she didn't need me, that she could rebuild her life without looking back. Part of me admired her resilience, but another part saw it as a facade, a mask to cover the hurt that I knew must be there. Occasionally, I'd run into someone who had spoken to her, and they would relay snippets of our story from her perspective. She painted herself as the one who had tried, who had been driven to desperation by my inattentiveness. She refused to acknowledge her part in the betrayal, instead casting herself as the victim, someone who had simply reached a breaking point. It stung to hear, but I knew I was just as guilty of my own spin on the story. The loneliness became suffocating. The friends I had once confided in seemed distant, their loyalty divided or exhausted by the constant tension. I started to retreat into myself, avoiding social gatherings, cutting off the connections that reminded me of what had been lost. Even Alex, who had been by my side from the beginning, began to pull away. He had his own life, his own worries, and I could tell he was tired of being caught in the crossfire of my broken marriage. And so, I sank into solitude, filling my days with work, trying to distract myself from the emptiness that had taken root in my chest. The house felt like a mausoleum, each room filled with echoes of arguments and accusations, of love that had soured into something unrecognizable. I told myself I would get through it, that time would dull the edges of the pain, but each day felt heavier than the last. Occasionally, I would see Emma's posts on social media, smiling photos with friends, captions that hinted at new beginnings and fresh starts. She was putting on a brave face, showing the world that she was moving on, even if her heart was still fractured. I felt a pang of jealousy, a bitterness that she seemed to be handling it better than I was. I wondered if she missed me at all or if she had already erased me from her life, moved on without a second thought. Despite her defiant public persona, I knew Emma well enough to see the cracks beneath the surface. She was hurting too, but she refused to let it show. She would rather bear the burden of loneliness than admit she had made a mistake. She would rather push forward, pretending that everything was fine, than face the reality of what we had done to each other. Every so often, I'd catch myself thinking about reaching out, about having one last conversation to clear the air, to find some semblance of closure. But then I'd remember the accusations, the anger, the hurt that had fueled our final confrontation, and I would stop myself. There was too much resentment, too many unresolved wounds. We had both played a part in this, both chosen paths that led us to destruction, and there was no going back. The process of finalizing the separation was brutal. Each step was a reminder of what we had lost, of the life we had once shared. We argued over finances, over who would keep which pieces of furniture, over the little things that, in the grand scheme, didn't matter but somehow felt like victories to be won. Our lawyer meetings were tense, filled with cold silences and exchanged glares, each of us determined to come out on top, even if it meant sacrificing the last shreds of civility between us. The strain took its toll, and there were days when I felt like I couldn't breathe, when the weight of the guilt and regret threatened to pull me under. I wondered how we had gone from love to loathing, from shared dreams to shattered illusions. I wondered if there was a point when we could have turned back, when we could have saved ourselves from the path we had chosen. But it was too late for such questions, too late for what-ifs. The only thing left was to see it through to the end. In the quiet moments, when the anger and bitterness faded, I would remember the person Emma had once been, the woman I had fallen in love with, the life we had dreamed of building together. I wondered if she thought of me the same way, if there were times when she, too, felt the sting of nostalgia, the ache of a love that had once been real. But those thoughts were fleeting, drowned out by the noise of separation, the process of dividing our lives into pieces that no longer fit together. We were both too proud, too stubborn to reach out, to admit the pain that still lingered. And so, we remained locked in our private battles, each refusing to show weakness, each determined to move on without looking back. The fallout was messy, painful, a slow unraveling of everything we had once held dear. But it was also a relief, a release from the weight of a marriage that had become a prison, a love that had turned toxic. And as the final papers were signed, as the last ties were severed, I felt a strange sense of freedom, mingled with a quiet sadness. Emma and I had both made our choices, had both contributed to the end of something that had once been beautiful. We had both paid the price for our actions, both felt the sting of betrayal, both suffered the consequences of our decisions. And now, all that was left was the silence, the emptiness, and the hope that, someday, we could find peace in the ruins of what had once been. The divorce moved forward, each step feeling like the end of a long, bitter war. The initial anger and blame had given way to a quiet acceptance, a reluctant understanding that our marriage was over, but that didn't make it any easier. Emma and I had spent years building a life together, and now, we were left picking up the pieces, each fragment a reminder of what we had lost. The process of moving on was far from smooth. I tried to reconnect with Sophie, hoping to find solace in the familiarity of our past. She had been a welcome distraction, a way to escape the mess with Emma, but now, when faced with the possibility of something more, I found myself holding back. The wounds from my marriage were too fresh, the scars too deep. I couldn't give myself to Sophie the way I once had, and she sensed it. One night, over a drink, Sophie looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "You're not really here, are you?" she asked, her voice gentle but knowing. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I thought I was ready, but I don't know. It's like part of me is still caught up in everything that happened with Emma. I didn't expect it to be this hard to move on. She nodded, giving me a sad smile. "I get it. You've been through a lot, James. Maybe you need some time to figure things out on your own." Her words were a relief and a disappointment all at once. I knew she was right, but I had hoped that being with Sophie could help me forget, help me move forward. But the truth was, I couldn't outrun the past, no matter how much I wanted to. The shadow of what had happened with Emma loomed over me, a constant reminder of the mistakes I had made, the love I had lost. Emma, too, seemed to be struggling. I would hear through friends that she was putting on a brave face, going out, trying to move forward. But I knew her well enough to recognize the signs of someone who was still hurting. She had always been good at hiding her feelings, at pretending to be stronger than she was. But beneath the surface, I could see the cracks. We met one last time to finalize the divorce, in a sterile office filled with paperwork and legal jargon. It felt surreal, sitting across from her, the woman I had once thought I would spend my life with, now reduced to a stranger on the other side of a desk. The air was heavy with unspoken words, memories that neither of us dared to voice. After the paperwork was signed, we found ourselves alone in the hallway, the finality of the moment pressing down on us. I searched for something to say, something that would capture the mixture of regret and gratitude I felt, but the words wouldn't come. Emma broke the silence, her voice soft and tentative. "It's strange, isn't it? After everything, I thought I'd feel relieved, but I just feel empty." I nodded, the ache in my chest a reminder of the love that had once been there, now replaced by a hollow void. "Me too. I thought this was what I wanted, but now that it's over, I just feel lost." We stood there, two people who had once shared everything, now unsure of what to say, how to part ways. I wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, some sign that despite everything, I didn't hate her. But the gap between us felt too wide, the damage too deep. "I'm sorry, James," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I know that doesn't change anything, but I am." I swallowed, feeling the lump in my throat grow. "I'm sorry too, Emma. We both made mistakes. I guess we just lost sight of each other." She nodded, wiping her eyes, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman who had once been my world. It was bittersweet, the nostalgia mingling with the regret, the sense of what could have been. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You too," I replied, the finality of the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. We walked out of the building together, but when we reached the sidewalk, we turned in opposite directions, each of us heading toward a future that was uncertain and daunting. I felt the weight of the years we had shared, the memories that would now become ghosts haunting the corners of my mind. But I also felt a strange sense of relief, a faint glimmer of hope that, somehow, I could rebuild, could find a way forward. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, moving boxes, and awkward conversations with friends and family. I tried to throw myself into work, into projects that had been neglected during the chaos of the separation. But the silence at night was deafening, the emptiness of the house a constant reminder of the life that had unraveled. I thought about Emma often, wondering how she was coping, if she, too, was haunted by the ghosts of our past. I knew that reaching out would only complicate things, that we both needed space to heal. But there were moments when I missed her, when I longed for the familiarity of her presence, the comfort of a love that, despite everything, had once been real. Over time, the pain began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. I found solace in small things, a new book, a walk in the park, the support of friends who had weathered the storm with me. I started to see glimmers of a future that didn't involve Emma, a life that I could rebuild on my own terms. Yet, despite the healing, the past remained a shadow, a reminder of the mistakes I had made, the hurt I had caused. I knew that moving on would take time, that the scars would linger, but I also knew that I had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The last time I saw Emma was at a mutual friends gathering, a casual event where we exchanged polite smiles and awkward nods. She looked different, older somehow, as if the ordeal had aged her. I wondered if I looked the same to her, if she saw in me the remnants of the man she had once loved. We didn't speak, but there was a moment when our eyes met, a brief flash of understanding passing between us. It was a silent acknowledgement of what we had shared, of the mistakes we had made, and the lives we had tried to build. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance that our paths had diverged, that we had each chosen our own way forward. As I left the gathering, I felt a sense of closure, a final farewell to a chapter that had defined so much of my life. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I had the resilience to face it, that I had the strength to rebuild. Walking away from Emma that last time, I felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by a faint but growing hope. I was free, untethered from the mistakes and regrets that had haunted me. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to navigate, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next. The story of James and Emma had come to an end, but my story was just beginning. And as I took that first step into the unknown, I knew that, despite the scars, I had the power to shape my own future, to find a new path, and to start anew.